howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it's time for some Path of Exile discussion. One of the biggest things that was done in 3.19 was a major overhaul to the Trickster. Where the Juggernaut saw only minor changes, the Trickster saw a complete overhaul. I wanted to come back now that we've had a couple of months to play around with it, and give a few thoughts on how successful the overhaul has been. This is the ascendancy as it looks, and I'll put a link down in the description below to this image. Just under 1 in 19 players are playing a Trickster at the moment. This is based upon the softcore trait-enabled Kalandra League. It's actually more popular in all of the hard modes. So it's more popular in solo self-found, it's more popular in hardcore, and it's more popular again if you're playing both of those hard modes at once in hardcore solo self-found. Now there's two biases, and I can't work out how significant these are. One of them is that, oh, this is new and shiny, let's try it out. And the other one is, no one's been able to work this out yet, I'm going to hold off until someone else comes up with the right build for this ascendancy. I don't know which of these is stronger, and they work in opposite directions, so really until 3.20 we won't see which of these is more significant. It is a pretty solid ascendancy at the moment. It's not as strong as the Inquisitor is, it's not as strong as the Occultist is, but it is definitely one of the better of the rest of them. So let's start with the question of defenses. What defenses are people using on their Tricksters? They are overwhelmingly more likely to allocate Chaos Inoculation than pretty much any other ascendancy in the game. It's still only a minority of Tricksters that are CI, but it is a large minority. 42% of Tricksters allocate Chaos Inoculation versus 14% for all high-level characters and 12% for non-Tricksters specifically. Tricksters overwhelmingly don't use Determination, only 25% do compared to 66% for non-Tricksters, and consequentially they use non-Molten Shell guards a lot more, or they use no guard at all. Immortal Call is the most commonly used guard on Tricksters, 33%, Molten Shell second at 24%, Steelskin third at 18%, and then there's Frost Shield, which is in a weird spot because it's not technically a guard, but sort of works a little bit like one, and that's being used on 16% of Tricksters, although only 4% are using it as their only guard. Lots of people aren't using a guard at all, and there are absolutely no examples of high-level characters that are Tricksters that are using Arcane Cloak. The best cluster for spell suppression on the passive tree, Inveterate, is being used by a large number of Tricksters. Now, Energy Shield, Leech, and Overleech, Evasion, Ghost Dance, Ghost Reaver, Spell Suppression. This is how most Tricksters are staying alive. And Spellbreaker and Heartstopper from the Ascendancy, alongside Leith Shade from the tree, get taken only occasionally, but not overwhelmingly often. They're viable options, but they're not commonly used. So let's start with the Escape Artist side and how well this has turned out. It's worth a quick recap that with the way that the Trickster Ascendancy is laid out, once you've Eternal Ascended and therefore got 8 points to spend in your Ascendancy, you're either going to take Escape Artist or you're taking everything else. All 4 of the 2-point nodes, or you're taking Escape Artist. And if you're taking Escape Artist, because it's one of the weaker nodes, you probably want to take at least one of the 2 that are behind it. So most people take Soul Drinker, which costs 4 points. This is the Energy Shield Overleech node. 58% of high-level Tricksters took it early, 73% take it now. Now this can indicate 2 things. Either the node Soul Drinker is really good and people underestimated it early, or Soul Drinker is something that works really well with great gear. I actually think both of these are the case, but I can't prove that. So I think that next league we will see a lot of people take Soul Drinker quite early, and then it will continue to get better for them as their character gets more powerful. Dealing more damage means that you will get more benefit from the leech aspects. Now Spellbreaker is something that people take early and then often spec out of later, as they're able to cap their spell suppression without it. It's something that's in a weird spot, where it has counter synergy with Ghost Reaver. Spellbreaker turns on your Energy Shield recharge when you suppress spell damage, at least sometimes, but Ghost Reaver, which is often taken especially alongside Soul Drinker, ends up turning off all of your Energy Shield recharge anyway. So there's a bit of counter synergy here, but this doesn't mean that you can't use the 2 together, because Ghost Reaver is so good on its own, and Spellbreaker is fine even without that last line. If it's just 20% chance to suppress spell damage, and prevent an additional 10% of suppressed damage when you have full Energy Shield, that's fine on its own. The last line is a little bonus. One thing that needs to be said about Escape Artist is that it is really bad with a bunch of unique items. So if you want to use a unique helmet on your build that does not have a large amount of Energy Shield on it, then you don't gain much from the 5 evasion rating per 1 maximum Energy Shield on helmet line. Additionally, a lot of people ruthlessly prioritize getting influence mods on their helmet, and this can mean that you don't have as much space for Energy Shield on it. So do keep this in mind. Also, Escape Artist adds a significant cost to capping spell suppression. This is because your helmet can provide no spell suppression if you decide to go with a Hubris Circlet. Now, if you decide to go with something like a Deicide Mask, which can roll spell suppression on it and also can have some Energy Shield, it's just going to have a lot less Energy Shield on it than a Hubris Circlet would have. Is it worth it? Ultimately, that decision is going to be up to you, but it is very difficult to get a large amount of both energy shield and spell suppression upon your helmet at the same time, and that means that Escape Artist ends up being a little bit weaker as your gear starts to get stronger. So we'll come back to this topic when we start talking about Heartstopper, because Heartstopper is being used a lot of the time by people who skip Escape Artist because they want to take Soul Drinker, but they get that on Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels, and therefore they don't take Escape Artist. So now we're on to Heartstopper, and whilst this is better than a lot of people think, it is the least popular node in the Ascendancy. Players undervalue inconsistent defenses in the game unless they're named block or spell block, and in softcore, this will prevent a large number of your deaths, just as block does. I definitely don't recommend relying upon Heartstopper if you're playing in hardcore, because in hardcore, something that prevents deaths 50% of the time isn't very valuable. However, in softcore, something that prevents deaths 50% of the time is outstanding. And so you should really give this some thought, because it actually averages out to the same amount of damage reduction as that awesome node in the Champion Ascendancy that grants you permanent 20 fortification. And also it can stack with Fortify if you get Fortify through other means. So Heartstopper is really, really good. Now, where this really shines the most is on Uber bosses, because they often leave piles of bad stuff on the ground that accumulate over the length of the fight. So this means that you are simultaneously taking hit and damage over time, damage in a lot of these fights. And this really comes up a lot on Uber Shaper and Uber Duber Elder. In both of these encounters, there's piles of garbage on the ground that you have to sort of sometimes duck and weave through while you're trying to dodge a bullet hell, but chances are you're not going to dodge every single bullet in the bullet hell. And then what this is going to mean with Heartstopper is that one of those damage sources is going to be nerfed by 40% when it hits you. Maybe it'll be the bullet hell hit, maybe it'll be the bad stuff on the ground. You're going to be taking damage from both of these simultaneously, and having one of them nerfed by 40% is a big deal. The one popular setup that uses Heartstopper eschews Escape Artist, takes all the 2-point nodes, then gets Soul Drinker through Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh. I really like this setup, and I think that if you can afford the relevant Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels, then this is something you should seriously consider if you elect to play a Trickster, because you'll get the benefit of things like Heartstopper and Swift Killer, which do something for every build. Of course, there's an opportunity cost to this. Your Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels can't be used to instead take something out of the Assassin Ascendancy or something out of the Saboteur Ascendancy, so ultimately it's up to you, but I really do like that setup. Next we have Polymath. Now, before the Overhaul hit, many people thought this was the best node. They were all right. You take Polymath, you make it work. This is the reason you're a Trickster Ascendancy. Now, one of the things that makes this really good is actually the Shadow's starting location. You are very near a diverse array of different masteries. For example, you are near the only Evasion and Energy Shield mastery on the entire passive tree. You're near a whole bunch of other masteries you're going to want to take. There's Evasion masteries, you definitely want to take one of those because it's going to give you Grace Reservation Efficiency. There's Life masteries, there's Energy Shield masteries, there's that Hybrid Evasion and Energy Shield mastery. There's also things like Resistance masteries that can be okay too. Lots and lots of different things that you can choose between here, and that's really, really good. So yeah, Polymath is fantastic. This is the reason you're a Trickster, and it's also something that you should seriously consider if you're playing either a Saboteur or an Assassin, that you would steal this via the use of Forbidden Flesh and Forbidden Flame jewels, because it is one of the very best choices in the entire Shadow class. Swift Killer is next, and this is niche. You shouldn't take it without powerful Frenzy Charge synergies, and that's the way it's being used. If you have those synergies though, don't skip it, and note that the duration applies to all charges. For light bossing, so Conquerors and down, this should mean that you're capped on endurance charges all fight if you generate them while you're mapping. Now, you should consider speccing Overcharged on the classic passive tree if you take this. I'm quite partial to getting this via Impossible Escape, the Conduit version, as this also gives you a bunch of other high quality nodes as well. So you can put the Conduit version of Impossible Escape in your passive tree in any dual slot. So if you do take the Conduit version of Impossible Escape and socket it in any dual slot on your tree, you'll be able to allocate things in a small radius of Conduit. And this includes one medium quality life node, a high quality spell suppression node, a medium quality projectile damage node, Overcharged, which is the thing we're talking about, and there's one or two other things as well. So this is a really good setup and I quite like it. One step ahead is next. 108% base action speed is equivalent to giving you Tailwind, unaffected by Chill, and unaffected by Freeze all in one location. Now this is already very good. You can get Chill and Freeze immunity or unaffected elsewhere, but always comes with an opportunity cost, and this is coming alongside essentially getting Tailwind, so really, really strong. The small aura that's like Temporal Chains but worse is all upside. And it does come in really handy when you face one or two specific arch nemesis mods. The main one is Frenzied, because Frenzied is an action speed increase, and this will make enemies with Frenzied considerably less dangerous than they'd otherwise be, which is a good thing because Frenzied is one of the single most dangerous arch nemesis modifiers. Now this is surprisingly cheap on Forbidden Jewels, especially with how good it is alongside the Saboteur's Pyromaniac node. The Saboteur's Pyromaniac node grants you shock and ignite immunity, as well as a lot of other things that only benefit a Trapper. So if you are playing a Saboteur and you can take one step ahead via the use of Forbidden Jewels, then you'll have effective immunity to all of the classic elemental ailments. You won't be immune to Sap, Scorch, and Brittle, but they're only really a major factor if you are running the Simulacrum. They do come up in Delirious mapping as well, but they're not as significant an effect there. So all in all, one step ahead is really good to harvest out of the Trickster Ascendancy if you're on a Trapper. We're talking like 2 or 3 Divine Orbs for the full set. So what's my recommended default mapping setup? This is the budget setup: Polymath, One Step Ahead, Escape Artist, and Soul Drinker. But if you can afford to get Soul Drinker on Forbidden Jewels, which should cost you about a dozen Divine Orbs at the moment, maybe a little bit more, then do that, drop Escape Artist and Soul Drinker, take Heartstopper and Swift Killer, and spec Overcharged if this is reasonable to do on your passive tree. Now to empower Polymath further, you can consider taking masteries that might otherwise be marginal in clusters you're already taking. However, don't take entire passive tree clusters just for Polymath. The opportunity cost is simply too high. Now if you want to do bossing, my default suggestion here is that you would take Escape Artist, Soul Drinker, Polymath, and then any one of One Step Ahead, Spellbreaker, and Heartstopper. However, it's worth pointing out that this Trickster is not what I would term a bossing specialist ascendancy. It's good enough to do bossing, but it's not something that I would say is fantastic at it. Heartstopper goes up in value again against bosses that leave enduring garbage on the ground: Uber Elder, Cortex, Feared, Maven, Uber Shaper, Azaro, etc. Now with Azaro, we're talking there about the traps, and it goes down in value against more hit-based bosses such as Atzri and the Formed. Now if you are doing Labyrinths, including level 83 ones a lot, then in that situation you're going to want Heartstopper, especially for the level 83 Labyrinths, where one of the biggest threats you'll face is the spike traps that inflict a large enduring bleed on you. Those things can kill you very quickly, and with Heartstopper, either the initial hit will be toned down or the enduring damage from the bleed will be toned down. Either way, that's going to help you a lot. So if your idea of bossing is farming the Eternal Labyrinth of Tribute in order to chase down those juicy Grand Spectrum jewel drops that find themselves in various silver key chests, then in that situation, a Heartstopper Trickster is something that I would seriously consider. Anyways, that's all I got on the Trickster Ascendancy overhaul. I think it's been pretty successful. The overhaul has made the Trickster go from not worth considering to a very viable consideration for a lot of diverse builds, and not an overwhelmingly powerful one that warps the entire meta around it. And I think that's a good spot for it to be. May your Varlobs have interesting results.